Hey everybody, my name is Ian, and today we're talking about Diane Ty's Baking for a Third Place, which is chapter 4 in Baking as Biography. If you've been watching the other videos, if you've been reading along, you kind of maybe already have a suspicion about where this chapter is heading. We've been talking about how much baking was part of the set of expectations of mid 20th century Canadian women, Atlantic Canadian women, and that it was a way that they performed femininity. It's a way that they performed motherhood. It's a way that they performed wifiness, uxorialness. It's a way that they performed being a member of the community, the sort of in loco parentis of children of friends of their children coming in, and so extending into the neighborhood, and then going into the church meetings, and the expectation of a performance of a certain kind of piety that takes place at these meetings, by without question, without hesitation, volunteering and giving one's work over to the greater good, because it is, whether that is in terms of a form of piety, form of holiness, whether that is being a good citizen, whether that is being a good member of the community, whether that is being a good or just a continuation of being a good wife, being a good helpmate, whatever is happening. Those are the conditions in which baking takes place. Baking is it's a way of meeting tastes, meeting at taste expectations. It's a way of doing caring work. It's a way of also displaying a number of things, displaying identity in terms of the use of, at least in home cooking, in terms of the ongoing presence of molasses and oats as signifiers of humble beginnings, even if those tastes become adapted over time or those ingredients become incorporated in different modes. You get that sense of continuity with the past, simultaneously with new ingredients, with more exotic ingredients, still not so exotic as to be foreign or incomprehensible, but exotic enough to at least express specialness by their very presence, and a specialness not simply of the ingredients, but really a specialness of this generation now has access to this food. So it's a specialness of modernity. Things are being expressed, and one of the points that she makes at the end of the last chapter is this notion of daintiness, and that the food that was presented in public is very different from the food that's presented in private. Both are made with care, but one is made for a different display event, and it's instead of merely accommodating to the tastes of one's family. And merely is not, it's not an adverb that I'm throwing away lightly, but the presentation that's going to be done for other women or for the community, but through the framework of the church, it's a much more public format. There are different kinds of foods that are being presented that display a certain amount of labor. Now, all of that seems to suggest this kind of top-down oppressiveness. And as I said at the end of the last video, is that if one's not careful, one runs the risk of thinking of the women as entirely denied of agency. That if we use this idea of sort of women's inherent oppression within these patriarchal structures as the only lens through which we understand this, then we are ultimately doing the women a disservice. And a lot of that is conditioned on this chapter, because this chapter makes a number of different claims that baking can lend itself to subversion, that could lend itself to pushing against that imposition, that even if one is working within it, one can resist it simultaneously. One can push back against it. And one of the things that allows for that is new products that ironically are part of the capitalist enterprise of industrialized food, and I guess in many ways in part of the hegemonic exercise in terms of communicating to wives and mothers that this is the best way to take care of your family, through that you can cook for a modern and cosmopolitan husband and a emerging modern and cosmopolitan family by using these modern and cosmopolitan foods, while also potentially taking away some of the toil that might otherwise be incumbent. And once you start suggesting that toil might be there, you've introduced the idea that these recipes are easy. These recipes are economical in terms of time and effort. All of a sudden, that points to the attention that, yeah, cooking takes time and effort. It's not that women didn't realize this, but these things opened for the critique. I am making dump cake. Dump cake is a perfect example of this. We have the beginnings of convenience foods, of packages, that still, there was the expectation that it wasn't, that packaged foods were not really the deliverable. That just simply making stuff from a package is in a way not doing women's work appropriately. So there's still this very strange thing that she points out, in that packaged foods you still needed to do something with them. Nevertheless, they could eliminate a lot of toil. So you wouldn't necessarily bake a cake from a cake mix, but you'll use cake mix in your baking as a time efficient manner. I got a sticky lid. I'm gonna have to be cleaning sticky off the countertop. You know that I don't like that. So dump cake calls for 1 can, and I got Sobeys because of Stellarton. Got 1 can of cherry pie filling. I didn't know this stuff existed because, you know, I'm in effete central Canadian, upper Canadian, I guess. Don't know this sort of thing. I'm presuming once the word dump is invoked, that is the action that I'm supposed to do. So I'm going to dump that in here. Didn't know how it would spread, so I'm going to transcend the recipe and suggest that I spread it out more or less evenly. 1 can of pineapple, crushed pineapple, not drained. Ow! On top. Again, I'll take liberties, do a little bit of spreading of this. 1 package yellow cake mix. Went to the store, didn't have yellow cake mix. They did have golden cake mix. This could be a disaster. This could be exactly totally okay. Sprinkle this on top. Look at me baking like a big boy. Not going to use the same spatula. There. Walnuts. I have no idea how the moisture from the cake, or moisture from the pineapple and stuff, works its way into the cake. I don't know the science. Coconut. Yeah, a little more. Then, into the oven. I've already preheated it. They say 30 to 35 minutes. So, she begins really with a reflection on the church teas, because the meetings, that obligation, that volunteerism, the way that one does a very public display of femininity and proper behavior and Christian piety, there is a sneaking suspicion that is supported by her fieldwork, by her the interviews with friends of Lorraine and other women of that generation, that one of the reasons why the meetings occurred. One of the reasons why people would go to the women would go to the meetings was precisely for the lunches, precisely for the food that accompanied them, in that it allowed for this kind of indulgence that that they wouldn't necessarily have. Remembering that women's work is constant, and that a theme that she picks up in this chapter is that no one can really remember the what Laureen or the other women in her circle not in motion, not acting, unless there is a form of playing hostess, having someone come over for coffee, and that is a pause in the day. That is a way of carving out time. Similarly with these meetings, by going to these meetings, by doing so, justified through the act of work, one is able to leave the house. One is able to leave the responsibilities of the domestic sphere. And, of course, one of the prices that one pays is the expectations of a new set of responsibilities, but it is a change of responsibility. Making, if it's your turn, making the nice couple of pans of squares or the sandwiches or whatever is sort of the entry fee to it. And then one goes to the meeting, and one does the meeting. One justifies one's reason for being there by doing work. And then it is time for the lunch. Sometimes the food, i.e. the sandwich or the oat cake, and always the sweet. And the sweet is two things. Both it is an indulgence. The foods are nice. We haven't even been speaking about this. We've been talking about how Laureen particularly, and women in general, have the expectation that they are catering to their family's tastes, and that only in a way only sort of tertiary considerations, sort of the paterfamilias, the others, and then herself is sort of the order in which tastes are dictated, seemingly. In the public sphere, there's the different repertoire that's chosen, and they are more delicate, refined, indulgent, perhaps. Maybe that's another word for the terms. They are less humble. If the molasses cookies and the oat cakes and the oatmeal cookies and all the recipes that she talks about in chapter 2, or basically those are tastes of home. One of the things that unites them is the sort of humility. They're still treat. They're not part of that sort of grub versus treat dynamic. They are still understandably treats. They are sweet. They are dessert-like. They are soothing. They are as opposed to nourishment. They are nevertheless humble, as opposed to the sort of the more display-oriented foods, and that they are delicate. They are light indulgences. And then what's over and above the indulgence of the taste is the indulgence of the time away, because the meeting could end without food. The meeting could come to an end, and the functional role of that meeting would be over. But the ritual aspect of concluding with a snack is, yes, it is then incumbent upon the women to serially volunteer to provide, but it allows them to have their sweet tooth. It allows them time away from home, and it creates leisure. It creates these pauses in the day when, instead of running around in a flurry of activity in one's domestic sphere, where the work is invisible, where the work is, because it's invisible, it is often unappreciated or unremarked upon, and that's kind of how you want it to be. Nevertheless, it is nice to have a pause. It's nice to have a rest in the day. It's nice to momentarily not be concerned with the immediate requirements of others, Rather, it's for the sociability of the self. She talks about third spaces because once Laureen moves to first to Charlottetown and then to Amherst, she has a different set of peers. Now, they might be drawn from the same community, in that they might be people that she meets through networks of instrumentality. So the church group, PTA, those sorts of associations. How do you meet people? And when you meet people and you gather together, from people with common cause, what you do, it might be convivial, but it is largely has that level of instrumental. And then you put upon the various scripts that we follow to make the instrumental feel convivial through food, through small talk, through catering, through the way seats are organized, and so on. And then from that grouping, this is not the necessary hard and fast way, but you can see this happening, in that from communities, from churches, from parent-teacher associations, from employee, workplace situations, you make connections with people that are clearly not merely instrumental. In fact, they might have very little instrumentality. They become networks of choice, not networks of obligation, even if you first met them through networks of obligation, not networks of ways of continuing the patterns of domestic and maternal and feminine labor into the larger community and doing it in some kind of public forum for which status is accorded. Rather, it is conviviality for the sake of conviviality's sake. They are moments of communitas. And she talks about third places. Women have historically, and doubly so in Nova Scotia, have been excluded from these third places. The Ray Oldenburg's idea of places that are not home and not work. And what Oldenburg typically describes, because the model is typically male because men have the privileged position within the society, and we see it, and then we see how the counter narrative is the coded ways of creating third spaces are present. And let me explain that incredibly convoluted sentence. So the third place are things like the bars, coffee shops, bowling alleys, even sort of front stoops or community places that are that men through because of men's work typically. Henry isn't a great example of this because Henry was working so often, but men's work is typically it's typically waged, for one thing, and it is typically something that takes place outside of the house. And so while one is working, one is, literally outside of the house, the outside, even if it is work that takes place on one's own property, it is often more outside than it is inside. It's seasonally based, and so we want to talk about sort of domestic, about sort of traditional economies. And then it takes place further removed from home. Unenviable labor. Let's not diminish men's work, but it has endings. It ends when one leaves that place, or when it's industrial, when it's capital, it ends when you leave the factory doors. And so men's labor, the patterning of men's labor has a more discernible distinction between work and not work, work and times of work and times of leisure. And so when men are not at work and when they are not asleep, or doing what limited domestic expectations are upon them, they have time, and often they will engage in convivial talk. They will gather together. We have things like Sandy Ives' idea of the two traditions, and we have Ray Oldenburg's third spaces, where they are new places. I'm not going to be defined by my position at work and the hierarchy that's typically there. I'm not going to be defined by my position at home and the hierarchy that's there. I'm among people in a similar situation as myself. I'm among peers. It is non-hierarchical. It is play. There's no instrumentality, capital I, that's associated with this, and it is times of play. And that's when and there's this whole industry, so specialized places that are designed to do that. The pub is perhaps the best example of that. It is some place that one goes to literally between work and home in order to have that non-hierarchical space, communitas, that moment of collective joy. Women have often historically been excluded from that. Nova Scotia's liquor laws have historically been insane, so there's very little opportunity for women, if they could even organize their time that way, if they had the liberty of being able to organize their time, of going to a place like a bar. Very few, or a pub, very few public places. So women's convivial space was carved out of the day. And she explains that the group in Amherst that were together for 40 years, that predated Lorraine's time there and went on long after Lorraine had moved back to Charlottetown and long after Lorraine had died. Friends from Amherst remember this thing starting in the 60s, and it was still going into the 21st century. And it was a couple of days a week gathering at one of the friends' houses for coffee. And coffee was just the time that was marked more than anything by laughter. And yes, there was baking that was required by the hostess, but the time was time spent. The kids were at school, husband was at work, and the living room more or less became a third place, a temporary third place where the women in this group that were there by volition, that were there because they chose to be there, because they found value and comfort and kinship within these circles of people, and they gather together. And so baking becomes yet another opportunity to do this. Baking becomes this opportunity. First, we have the church meetings where, even under the guise of volunteerism, I can just time to myself. I can have something sweet. I can be with people. I'm not at home. This is wonderful. And all of a sudden, that sense of obligation goes, oh, something is happening here. Then you have the next stage where it's the coffees at home. But we still have all the responsibilities. We still have the domestic responsibility. We still have the group responsibilities. All of those are still present. And we go back to the convenience foods. Because what the convenience foods did is a number of things. One is that they were presented to the women through a number of different vehicles, through magazines primarily, and that magazines became this instrument for communicating the new mentality. And you should read that description of the chiffon cake and the recipe of the chiffon cake that was even circulating in Cape North in the early 1950s. So just as Lorraine was starting out. And the chiffon cake had been introduced in, I don't have it on me, I think it's Better Homes and Gardens in 1948. And so it was it required products. It required all these new materials. And she makes this point about the chiffon cake, which again is very similar. When a new recipe is introduced like that through a popular culture source, and it looks, first of all, it looks like it might be good. And that might be a very glib, shallow, uninteresting thing to say, but this looks like it might be good is the basis for experimenting with new things. And so this looks like it might be good is already a judgment that the baker has. Now, it's suggested that it is good. There are descriptors that go into it, that it is perhaps elegant, perhaps modern, all these adjectives that we might associate that might be adjectives that portend a value that one could see as being desirable, so that they are so that they are easy, that they are efficient, they are modern, they are effortless, they are good, they're wholesome. I mean, it's not all about making the women about sort of status. There might be a sort of a number of different values associated with them. But all these things which are good. So you have a number of people, you have this, from this popular culture source, you have this thing that is presented as potentially being good and received by experienced bakers as potentially being good. I can imagine an occasion where I would present this. And so, I mean, that is how things enter into repertoires. This new thing will fill a slot that I already fill with a number of different things. So this will have this sort of functional slot to it. It'll also demonstrate, it'll be novel. It'll demonstrate something. And it might be, I presume it will be good. I know, looking at the recipe, because I am a competent baker, I know that this is something that I can accomplish using my culinary skills. Therefore, I will try and accomplish it using my culinary skills. And so Henry recognized the chiffon cake and said, "Yeah, that was making the rounds." And so this is the point that I'm getting towards, in that as one is making it, it isn't. You know that it's coming from a magazine. You might have got this recipe from other people in your community. It might have come from the magazine, but might have entered into it, and you sort of get it from someone who got it from the magazine or some kind of chain of association. And the recipe that she had was handwritten. It wasn't, but it was remarkably contiguous with the one in the magazines. But as you're making it, you know that even though you are making it in your home, other people are making the similar thing. Other people might be making this very thing at the same time. And there is something about that presentation of the individual instance of it and the collective that is, I'm only making this association now, and she makes this point, but I'll find the text and I'll pop it on the screen somewhere, where she makes the same point, and that as you're making it, you know that other people are making the same thing. And that is very similar to the approach that we have to the idea of popular culture, in that two aspects of it. First of all, that we are not passive recipients of popular culture, but we will take things and we will, through processes of bricolage, through processes of selectivity, we will take those products and we will make them our own, whether in a very sort of disruptive kind of way, like in the aesthetics of punk, where we'll take received products and tear them or repurpose them, like baby pins for jewelry and so on, or the inside of a locker decoration, where we'll take magazines and we will collage them into something else, or myriad other instances. We receive. We might, we get the collected works of a music artist, and we will have our favorites, and we'll generate our own hierarchy that might be different from other people. So even though we are not immediately responsible for the initial creation of it, and that initial creation might come from outside of our home community, nevertheless we engage with it in a creative way. Similarly with these recipes, and with mass prepared food like cherry pie filling or Betty Crocker cake mix, you have people who are able to take these products from popular culture and repurpose them and make them their own and display something from them. But the point that I'm making in this instance is that by doing so, with a chiffon cake, simultaneously as one is listening to a song, or through over the radio or on an LP, or one is baking a recipe from a magazine, you know that other people are doing, in other places, are doing something similar at that particular moment, or at least certainly at like high holidays and so on. And that kind of ties you in. You create, this Andersonian idea of like an imagined community. Benedict Anderson had this, took this idea that Hegel had, where the notion that reading newspapers is like morning prayer, and that you do it by yourself, but you know that around the nation at the same time, everyone is basically doing the same thing. And that sort of ties you into this community of people that go outside of your immediate confines. So as you're making a chiffon cake in Cape North, the same chiffon cake recipe that you got from a magazine that you know is in circulation around North America, you and someone from around North America, a woman in a similar situation but far removed geographically, perhaps even spatio-temporally, is doing the same thing. And as such, you are in some kind of community with them. But then the other aspect with these convenience foods is that they do fit these functional slots. And as I said at the very beginning, when these are presented as ways of being more convenient, all of a sudden you recognize, or you have underscored, the idea of inconvenience as a de facto part of women's labor. If these are labor saving, then you know that there is, by contrast, labor intensive. So a positive description actually opens up the possibility of critique of one's immediate circumstances. Experienced bakers will read a recipe, and they will know that will fulfill the expectations of their audience, while simultaneously saving them labor. Saving them not simply labor, but time. And so, okay, I can use this again. I can use this. This will meet the expectations of my family, meet the expectations of the public, and I can do it in 15 minutes as opposed to an hour and a half. So much of the history of 20th century cooking is about the provision of the discovery of new ingredients, whether that is condensed soups, whether that is not new ingredients, but the beginnings of certain packaging that eliminates steps, of laborious steps. She has that long description of Jell-O. She has that long description of Cool Whip. If she were talking more about cooking as opposed to baking, she would be talking about condensed soups, but ways that opened up the possibility of new foodways. Sometimes foodways that were not new because they were cosmopolitan, but new because they were prior to this. They would have been the result of intense labor. 19th century gelatin desserts were incredibly labor intensive, but prior to the development of instant Jell-O and instant gelatin, it was difficult. And so it was had a lot of rendering that had to go on. So they were elite foods, and all of a sudden they became middle class foods. And they could encourage this level of daintiness because they were wondrous. There's a wonderful story by Dom DeLillo called Sputnik, and it is actually a description. It's actually a chapter from the book that became Underworld, but it was published separately in the New Yorker in the late 90s. And it's part of the story is the mother in this vignette making her Jell-O desserts, and she's making her Jell-O desserts, and she's putting them in the Kelvinator, and she's just looking at her kitchen that is filled with modern appliances and sort of jet set and jet age aesthetics. It's the night that Sputnik is flying overhead. It's a sort of a critical moment in American history. So it's in the mid 1950s. That's this wonderful description of Jell-O, and I highly recommend. Like Dom DeLillo needs my marketing whiz. I'm going to check the cake and see how that's going. Okay, so I put it in for, what did I put it in for? I put it in for 35 minutes, but the recipe said do 25 to 35. So I'm just going to quickly test. Don't know exactly what I'm testing for. The toothpick is coming out reasonably clean. I'm just going to put it in for the entire time. See what that does. Time is a resource. Time is a precious resource when your time is not allocated between work and leisure. If you can accomplish all that you are expected to accomplish in less time, you have liberated yourself and introduced the concept of spare time, introduced the concept of leisure, introduced the concept of a certain amount of relief from that burden of expectation. And that's how we get to the idea of baking as a somewhat subversive act. Now, I've skipped over a lot of her discussion of coding, using Radner and Lancer's ideas of women's coding, which is a good thing to, it's not a good thing for me to skip over, but it's a good thing to remember is actually in place. The idea is that with coding, is that groups will, that women's culture in particular, but it extends to many groups, do this if they are in some kind of position of power differential, and the not the beneficiary of a power differential. So women's culture within dominant patriarchal men's culture, African American culture within white supremacy, LGBTQ plus culture within heteronormativity, where expressing dissent, expressing dissatisfaction, expressing mutual concern over potentially how this oppressive group has caused harm to another member, is sometimes a dangerous act. So one does so through codes that are messages to each other that, were they to be overheard, were they to not be coded, if they were to be overheard by the oppressive class, genuine harm could come. Anything from embarrassment to violence and death, because welcome to the world, it sucks. So messages become coded, and there are a number of different strategies. Some of them include such things as distraction by, just simply by averting attention away from those strategies, drowning out message perhaps. Some of them are trivialization. Women's culture is particularly adept at trivialization, in part because of the sort of the dominant, if the dominant mode is to not take women seriously, to not take women's labor seriously, demand it be there, but nevertheless devalue it, then women can turn that to their advantage and basically say, oh, it's just girls talk. So you can actually be engaged in some kind of gossip, as it were, where gossip is actually, much of the time, gossip is a way of communicating genuine news in the community that might be, were it to be overheard or were to be really broadcast, could potentially bring harm or ridicule. So gossip is, but if the gossip that could be leading to danger, it's like, oh, I think we got to take care of Jen because of what her mister is doing. If that's overheard, that could lead to some particular harm, but you could just dismiss it. Oh, it's just girls talk. Just let us be. Just go away. And so all of a sudden, trivialization is one of those genres. Incompetence is one. The demonstration that, and again, that idea that if I am unable to do this, but being unable to do it is actually basically a form of refusing to do work. And again, Diane points out to a number of different examples of that. But one of the things about coding is that it is a way that we can interpret action. So even if the women themselves or the subordinated group themselves would not express their act as subversive or forms of resistance, we can nevertheless read that into those acts. I think that's a kind of it can be a slippery slope on the level of interpretation. You have, like Elaine Lawless's, I was afraid someone like you, an outsider, wouldn't understand, as kind of an example of that, where you don't say, these women are exercising It's ready. Where these women are exercising resistance, and the women are like, no, we are not. And Lawless basically leads up saying, I think they are, but I do have to respect how they understand their own circumstances. And so we'll end up in some kind of hermeneutic uncertainty where nevertheless both our cards are laid on the table, my interpretation, their interpretation, and it'll be dialogic without necessarily being able to confirm once and for all. So this level of subversion is basically recognizing as an intelligent reading of their particular situation, an intelligent understanding of it, and working within that system in order to create something new. Okay, taking this out again. Ooh, I saw a big cherry bubble. Might be wondering, hey Ian, why aren't you using an oven glove? And with all the baking I've been doing for these videos, my oven gloves got very dirty, and I put them in the washer. And of course, with a washer, they get wet, and you're not supposed to dry them, so now they are wet. And I do know that when your oven glove gets wet and you touch stuff from the oven, all of a sudden it gets wicked hot. So that's why I'm now using a cloth. Well, I went to the very bottom. It didn't come out stained with cherry. Yeah, look at that. So I think we're good. It's also freaking hot. It's just from the oven. It's filled with liquid, unlike the oat cakes, which cooled down pretty quickly. Unlike the white cookies, which cooled down fairly quickly. This is going to be hot for a long time, so I'm not going to extend the video long enough for it to cool down to a temperature, but I'll kick the cameras up again just to give you an extra little treat later on. However, this article is about the self. So if the first, again, once we move past chapter 1, if the first major chapter, chapter 2, Feeding Our Family Well, is about the audience of the family, and the performer understanding the audience of the family. And I use the word audience because they are the intended recipient of the performance that is baking. And the performance that is baking is also a performance of maternalism, is also a performance of femininity, is also a performance of et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And if the second major chapter, chapter 3, church lunches and ladies' teas, are about the performance for the community, more public, but more than anything, it isn't simply the indeterminate community. It is community comprised of peers who are not really in competition with each other, nevertheless are engaged in this self-mediating mode of instructing each other and learning from each other simultaneously, both on what it is to be a good member of this community, good woman, good United Church attendee, good mother, good Atlantic Canadian, good citizen, good Christian, good whatever. That there is this canon that's going through. The foods that she prepares for this crowd are different. And this chapter is about foods prepared for herself and people that she feels a great bond with, people that she has had enter her orbit by choice, people she wants to be friends with, people that she feels she belongs to, and by identifying those kind of communities that are not built on instrumentality and again, she's not rejecting her family in any way, but the expectations of familial inter-obligations. Rather, they're purely volitional. They are a way of doing identity work. She defines herself as in a large part, and she finds a great freedom in defining herself within that community of peers. without undermining that she might define herself and as at least making a noble and earnest effort at being a good wife and mother that is often reflected and validated by other members of the community. And she is making a good faith effort at being a good minister's wife and a good member of the church. And that is sometimes reflected back on her. The fact that she is also doing this does not negate the fact that she might find value in agency and validation from these things. But this is hers. And the more that she can make time for this, the more that she can make an identity that is based on, that is centered on her, that is centered on what she can do for herself and not what she's doing for others, where the invisible work is self-directed, and where the effortlessness is also the sprezzatura, is also working towards actually reducing effort. It's not meant to look effortless. It's hoping to be more effortless, actually more effortless. It's just a little form of resistance, a little thing where she is making it her own. It's just sort of a beautiful little chapter. It's a beautiful chapter because, I mean, Diane hasn't been hiding this trajectory, but if this were to be left out, you would, I think, ultimately pity Loreen. And this chapter removes that hermeneutic of pity, takes it right out. That she knows what she was doing. She recognized the limitations that over which she had little control, the things over which she did have control. She worked them. She worked it, baby. Have no fear. That's why it's awesome. All right, my friends, as I said, this is still too hot, so I will fire up the cameras and cut it open just to give you one little sense of what that's going to be. Otherwise, until next time when we are reading chapter 5, Tasting the Past, and summarizing the book. It'll be the last chapter, last video. I wish you absolutely nothing but the best. So be well and eat well, and I will see you later. Bye-bye. Okay, just for completeness sake, here we are. Put that a little bit forward. That is the dump cake. I meant to cut it into squares, but I really don't know what kind of consistency it has. It is very liquidy. And I was looking up dump cakes online afterwards, and they are very popular as sort of like a TikTok kind of dessert. The idea that you can basically do what I did earlier. Just throw the ingredients in, throw them in the oven, woof woof. How this cuts into squares, I don't exactly know. But let's see. Okay. And I'll do one. The length, the width. Okay, the complaint that some very big snobby person was having on a food blog was that the cake mix doesn't necessarily get wet. And so anything that doesn't actually get moisture in it is just powder. And I can see that, and I saw that going in. The instructions are to not stir, to put everything on top. Then again, sometimes they suggest doing things like putting butter on it and having that as the moisture, and using not melted butter, because that'll also engage in pockets. But anyway, here it goes. Well, it doesn't, I don't know if any of it actually congealed into cake, so it's kind of like hot powder. It's tasty, but it's tasty because it's basically cake dough. And then pineapple is good. Cherry's not my favorite, but the cherry flavor is quite nice. I don't know. That's about as close to a piece of cake as you get in this. And it's still, look, basically just a pile of powder. So not necessarily a great success. And I was just, in this same process, I was talking to Diane. She said she doesn't even know if her mother actually ever made it, which is an interesting point. And didn't know whether her mother would be happy to be associated with the idea of a dump cake. It tastes good. It tastes good because it hits all the flavor aspects. You can taste the coconut, you can taste the cake mix, you can taste the pineapple, you can taste the cherry. It's not really a cake. It's not really a thing. It's a delicious mess. But maybe that's the point. Anyway, can't say I didn't try. That was that. Success, failure? I don't know. It's up to you, my friends. Let's have one more look at that. But I will see you later.